All right, well, our Bible year continues on. We have this past week finished the Psalms, and we began on Friday to read the Proverbs, the book of Proverbs. It's the kind of book that we probably have all heard quoted from time to time, usually only one verse or two verses, usually out of context, but probably haven't read it all the way through from cover to cover. And so if that describes you, we are certainly in good company. Iris Edwards, who sings in a choir at the 11 o'clock, she shared a story this last week as she was ready to read the Proverbs. She said that more than 50 years ago, her husband Walter, who passed away this past year, was a pastor. She said that we were at a Christian meeting of some kind, and she said, I remember this testimony. I'd never heard one like it before or since. It was a lawyer who was giving his testimony, and he said, you know, my wife was a believer, and I was not, and she used to just leave the Bible like sitting out open on the counter in hopes maybe I'd trip and accidentally read it or something. And I grabbed it one day, he said, and I found myself in the book of Proverbs, and as I flipped through, I said something like, hey, this stuff is true. Is everything else in here true? And that began his whole journey of faith. And Ira said, in all of my years in church, I've never heard a testimony of someone coming to Christ because of the Proverbs. It's just not what we think of when we think of the gospel, as helpful as they are. Now, to properly understand the book of Proverbs as we read through it, we need to understand that this is a unique kind of literature in the Christian Bible. It's a part of what's called the wisdom literature, the wisdom literature. Now, we've read, up until this point, a lot of the historical books. It talks about the story of the people of God and their journey. And later this summer, we're going to read about the prophetic literature from the prophets, and they're going to talk about what that history means for Israel's future. Both the judgment because of the ways that they've strayed, but also the hope of how God intends to restore them. But wisdom literature stands alone in a very unique way in the Bible. In the heart of wisdom literature, and in the Hebrew Bible, these three books are consecutive. They're held in one collection, and it's Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. This is the heart of wisdom literature in the Old Testament. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, and you really should read them together and consider them together to get a full picture. Because all of these books are addressing the same kind of questions. What kind of world are we living in? And what does it look like to live well in this world? That's what it's really was, trying to understand the meaning of it all and how to live a good life. That's really the fundamental question, how to live a good life. And each of these books tackles those questions from a unique perspective, so you really can't read them in isolation. You have to understand all of them together. Now, the Bible Project, which is one of the great resources we're using for this journey through the Bible, this Bible year, describes these three books, personifies them, and it says we should think of Proverbs like a brilliant young teacher, and the book of Ecclesiastes like a sharp, middle-aged critic, maybe, smoking on a pipe and telling you the way they think it really is. And then Job, this weathered old man who has seen a lot in his day, that hard-worn wisdom. Now, we're going to get more in depth in each of these over the next month to kind of understand how the Bible speaks into these big questions. But here's the short version. Here's the Cliff Notes version, in case you have summer vacation or something. Proverbs shows us that God is wise and just. It's just really clear. It's very straightforward. God is wise and just. God has ordered the world so it's fair. Those who do the right thing are rewarded. Those who do the wrong thing are punished. You get what you deserve. That's the way God set up the world. But then Ecclesiastes comes in and says, well, not so fast, my friend. Take a look around. People don't always get what they deserve. The world isn't always fair. Life is unpredictable, and it's hard to comprehend. And then Job steps in and says, and really, is God even really just? Because if so, how come bad things keep happening to really good people? And by the way, Job never really gets around to answering that question. But you can see the kinds of questions the wisdom literature drags up. This is thousands of years ago, asking the same kind of questions that we ask even today. So these are really big questions. And they're a part of the beautiful tapestry of our Bible, and we are, over the next 3 weeks, really going to focus in on the Proverbs. Remember that brilliant young teacher, this book of Proverbs, this teacher who seems to know a little bit about everything in life. I kind of think of her as a biblical Google search for life. Like, you're having trouble with your marriage, you're having trouble with your kids, having trouble at work, hey, we got a proverb for you. You got it? We got a proverb, don't worry. And I think that's one of the great gifts of the Proverbs. And the invitation in Proverbs, as you read through the entire collection, is that there's an invitation throughout to continue to grow, to continue to learn, to continue to grow in your knowledge and in your understanding, because the things you think you know now may not be what you're going to find. In the very first verses of the book, it tells us the purpose of the Proverbs, chapter 1, verses 2 through 6. Their purpose is to teach wisdom and discipline, to help one understand wise sayings, to provide insight and instruction, which is righteous, just, and full of integrity, to make the naive mature, the young knowledgeable and discreet, the wise hear them and grow in wisdom. Those with understanding gain guidance. When I read those words this week, a quote I came across recently by the contemporary philosopher, who's really his own proverb, Eric Hoffer. He wrote, "In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists." I need to hear that far more often than I want to admit. This is what Proverbs is inviting us into, to always be a learner, to not just sit and rest on the things I learned 30 years ago and I've never dug any deeper or asked any new questions or tried to understand more, even if life seems to complicate the answers I thought I knew. It's all about a humility, in other words. And I've been at school, and I got 3 degrees in religion, and the humility of the fact that there's more I don't know than I've ever learned in my entire life. There's a humility regarding what we currently know. And Proverbs invites us into a lifelong journey of wisdom. Grow in our knowledge, grow in our understanding. And to not put too fine a point on it, when you get to Proverbs chapter 18, verse 2, it says very plainly, "A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing personal opinion." Is that not made for the social media age? I don't know what is. No pleasure in understanding, only in expressing personal opinion. But then a few verses later it says, "An intelligent mind acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge." It's not past tense, it's always present tense. Always something we're continually doing. And by the way, those last 2 verses, these are what we usually think of as Proverbs. These are short, clever sayings that offer a little bit of wisdom about all kinds of different aspects of life. I mean, you can put these things on a fortune cookie. And all of those kind of Proverbs are found in chapters 10 through 29, what we might think of these Proverbs, chapters 10 through 29. But in the book of Proverbs, there's a whole lot more going on. In the first 9 chapters, we are presented with the concept of wisdom itself. Now, in Hebrew, wisdom, the word we translate as wisdom, is chokmah. Chokmah. I think we have a slide that says chokmah. It looks like chokmah, but I'm assured that it's pronounced chokmah. I think you have to loosen up a little something there to say it right. Chokmah. And the way that wisdom in the Proverbs presents us in the first 9 chapters is that this chokmah, this wisdom, is actually a creative force that's an aspect of who God is. This wisdom is an invisible creative force in the universe that can guide people in how they should live. It's an attribute of God that the wisdom books say that it was in wisdom that God created the world. That chokmah has been woven into the very fabric of the universe so that whenever people are making good and just and wise decisions, they're being guided by God through God's wisdom. This chokmah, that's energy, this wisdom. And whenever someone's making bad decisions, they're working against the grain of the universe as God designed it. And so for the first 9 chapters, we have a series of speeches from a father to a son. That's how it's set up. It's not just a collection of these pithy sayings. It's these speeches of a father to a son. And chokmah, wisdom, is personified as Lady Wisdom. And we're introduced to her in the middle of chapter 1. We read this: "Wisdom, chokmah, shouts in the streets. In the public square she raises her voice. Above the noisy crowd she calls out. At the entrances of the city gates she has her say. How long will you clueless people love your naivety? Naivety. There it is, naivete. I knew who to look to for that one. Naivete. How long will mockers hold their mocking dear? How long will fools hate knowledge? You should respond when I correct you. Look, I'll pour out my spirit on you. I'll reveal my words to you." So wisdom, this wisdom is available to anyone who is willing to listen and anyone who is willing to learn. And those who heed her voice will be guided in the way of a good and a beautiful life. And this wisdom, this chokmah, isn't just abstract intellectual concepts. The same word gets used in the Bible to describe the work of artisans, of woodworkers, and of craftsmen. That learning to live by God's wisdom is something that takes practice, and something that takes patience, maybe even apprenticeship, something that we practice over a lifetime. This is how God's wisdom gets built into our lives. That's how we craft a good life. And the other idea that this gets linked to, right in the first chapter of Proverbs, is the fear of the Lord. And I'm sure you've heard that throughout the Bible, but the fear of the Lord. It gets used right in chapter 1, verse 7. Wisdom, chokmah, begins with the fear of the Lord, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, when it uses fear of the Lord, the reason it says fear is simply because we don't have a good English word to capture what that means in Hebrew. It's not fear as in we're afraid of God, or we're sitting and trembling with fear or terror. It's not about terror. What this fear is a healthy sense of reverence and awe of God and understanding our place in relationship to God. It's a mindset, again, of humility. You'll hear that a lot. Fear of the Lord is recognizing that I'm not God, and that I need to humble myself before God and allow God's wisdom to teach me. So that's what chokmah is, this aspect of God's work and presence in creation, and we come before God's wisdom with humility and an openness to learn and grow. And that's really the attitude that we need to bring with us as we come to the Proverbs. What is it that we can be taught here? What is it that we can learn? And that takes us to the second section of Proverbs. Those chapters 10 to 29, it's a collection of hundreds and hundreds of proverbs about any and all aspects of life. It's really more of like a reference book that you could pull off the shelf and look it up, like in the encyclopedia. I need to find a proverb for this. If you have a specific question, a specific concern, a particular situation. And a lot of the proverbs, as you'll read them, they're just good common sense. Like that lawyer who picked it up and said, oh, this is true. This stuff just makes sense. They're helpful reminders about how to live with integrity, how to live with honor. It's important to remember with these proverbs, though, that these proverbs were not etched in stone from atop some high mountain. What the proverbs really are is a collection, an accumulated insight of God's people throughout many generations about how to live in a way that honors God and to live in a way that honors other people. The challenge of Proverbs is it does have this assumption, though, that God has ordered the world so it's fair, as I said earlier, that we do the right thing, we're rewarded, we do the wrong thing and we're punished, that we get what we deserve. And that's, every single chapter, you hear that over and over and over and over again. And like Ecclesiastes, that they'll step in later, we realize that assumption doesn't always hold. Sometimes really bad things do happen to really good and wise people who've made all the right decisions. And sometimes foolish people, those who have willfully chosen to be ignorant, those who have willfully chosen to be selfish, those who have willfully chosen to be greedy or to be heartless, sometimes they win. Life doesn't always seem fair. We don't always get what we deserve. And so how do we wrestle with that as we're reading the Proverbs? Well, one commentator, and almost every commentary I pick up talks about this. They said, first of all, think of these as probabilities, not promises. That if you live by this wisdom that we'll read in Proverbs, your life will probably be more stable, it will be more positive, it will be more meaningful. It may not. It's not a promise, but it is a probability. Another said that there's no guarantees, that lots of things can and often do go wrong, and as one person puts it, these Proverbs give us a general rule. They don't give us the exceptions. That these things are generally true, but there's exceptions to every single one of them. We just aren't picking those exceptions up. But there was still another that suggested the real gift of the Proverbs is they show us the best way to live regardless of the outcome. That we can't always control or predict or understand what's going to happen as a result, but the invitation to live with this kind of integrity and honor is worthy regardless of that outcome. That's why we read the Proverbs in conversation with Ecclesiastes and with Job, because these holy scriptures acknowledge that life is too complex for simple formulas, and together they push us to a deeper understanding and really to a humility before the mystery of life and a mystery of our faith. And I think this humility serves us well because then we're open to how God might teach us, what new insights we might have, what new perspectives we might gain, what new understandings are there right in front of us, what new ways of living a faithful and righteous and just life looks like. Humility allows us to never stop growing in our knowledge and love of God and of one another. And I think that humility is what's behind what I think is one of the best known Proverbs. It's in chapter 3. It's in verses 5 and 6. And this is one you've probably heard before, even if you didn't know the source. Trust in God with all your heart. Don't rely on your own intelligence. Don't rely on everything you already think you know. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Know Him. Know Him in all your paths, and He will keep your ways straight. Trust in the Lord with all your hearts. Now, surrounding these verses in the middle of chapter 3 is all those things I've just talked about. There's a lot of conversation about how seeking wisdom will make your life span longer, and it will make your bones stronger, and it will add to your material goods so you'll have security and comfort. And again, those may happen and they may not. But the question is, if those incentives for following God's wisdom were taken away, and if trusting in God doesn't bring those kinds of tangible rewards, would you still follow? Would you still be willing to trust in God with all of your heart, no matter what comes? Because being willing to learn, being willing to grow in understanding, being willing to grow in our knowledge of God's ways, it's scary sometimes. It's scary to let go of things that we used to know and trust that God is leading us to something deeper. But it's important, particularly if we can separate it from the outcomes, because by the time we get to Jesus, He tells us all who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them. All who lose their life because of me will find them. Why would people gain the whole world but lose their souls? And so we read the Proverbs from this side of the cross, realizing that God's wisdom may bring no reward. Instead, God's wisdom may cost us everything. And that's why following God's wisdom takes courage, that living a life following God's wisdom, a life of integrity and a life of fairness, living a life of equity, a life that doesn't take shortcuts around doing the right thing, a life that is selfless and generous and sacrificial, a life of service, a life that puts others ahead of ourselves, that allows us to look out for others' interests instead of our own, a life after the example of Jesus Himself. That may not appear wise or common sense to the rest of the world that tells us to look out for ourselves, that it's all about us and that the ends always justify the means. Well, we still trust in God and trust our life decisions and how we choose to serve God. Well, we trust in God with all of our hearts. Trust in God's goodness and mercy and love, because that is the way of the cross. I shared in Bible study a few weeks ago, I think back in May, and I think it was while we were looking at Job or maybe Esther, but it's this prayer by a man named Thomas Merton. He's one of the most influential Christian thinkers and writers of the 20th century. He was a Trappist monk, and this prayer is one that I always keep near me, because I think it captures what really trust means in light of Proverbs. And this is how it goes, and it's our closing prayer for today. My Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself, and the fact that I think I'm following your will does not mean that I'm actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore will I trust you always. Though I may seem lost and in the shadow of death, I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. Trust in God with all your hearts. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.